Hello there, my name is Maike. Can you hear me like this? Oh, perfect, okay. Let me outline what you can expect from the next 30 minutes. So this lecture deals with the digital divide from a software perspective. I'm going to talk about what the digital divide is all about. So, in short, digital divide or digital inclusion, as many say today, these terms describe that poor country, thank you, developing countries do not have access to information and communication technologies, especially to the internet. And this is seen as an obstacle for development and for economical growth. So I know at first glance it does not sound pretty comprehensible why access to the internet should help to fight poverty, because this is what it's all about. But the whole matter becomes a little more clear when taking into account that today it is not so much material goods anymore, but non-material goods, information and knowledge, which are much contested trade commodities and which are very important sources of wealth and power. And not having access to the internet equals exclusion from markets and equals exclusion from important information of any kind, be it health information or be it political information, you name it. All right, I'm going to give some basics on free software, on open source as you like it, and I'm going to explain why free software has a lot of great potential to induce a more even distribution of wealth and to let more people participate in the so-called digital age. I'm going to talk a little about Brazil's IT policy because they are very active in promoting free software in digital divide issues. I heard someone call them the open source nation, so that's a pretty good compliment. And I'm going to give some basics on intellectual property rights, and I want to explain what they have to do with the digital divide. And I'm going to talk about some difficulties free software faces as well. Before I get started, one more thing. I know there are lots of discussions going on whether to use the term free software or whether to use the term open source. So since this lecture is not the place to discuss this issue, so I just use both terms equally. Okay, some more background information. I spent a while in a very poor region of this world. I lived and worked in Latin America for a while, in Nicaragua, for example, and I taught web design there, so I take interest in these issues. I have a background in cultural sciences, and I actually wrote my master's thesis about the digital divide and software because I noticed a pretty big contradiction, and that was that on the one hand you have hackers, programmers, and they say, yeah, we should use free software, that's a great idea, and it has a lot of advantages to help to let more people participate in communication technologies, and they have very good reasons for their attitude. But on the other side, you have all the people who actually shape this policy issue of the digital divide. So you have NGO staff, lots of NGOs out there who deal in digital divide issues. You have local government entities, policymakers, and they just do not have software or open source, especially on their agenda. So I wanted to find out the reasons for this big contradiction. So I had contact to the free software scene in Latin America, and I did qualitative interviews with them. And I don't want to bore you with details about qualitative interviewing. If you're interested, you can download my master's thesis. I put it all down there. You can download it on my blog is fair-code.net. You find it there. So the basic idea about social research interviews is if you want to know why a certain problem is how it is, or you want to find out something about a situation, so why not talk to people who deal in these issues every day? And that's what I did. I talked to Federico Heinz, and he's a speaker of the Free Software Foundation. He's from Argentina, and he focuses on the digital divide and on sustainable development. Second person I interviewed that was Fernanda Wyden. She's a free software programmer. She works for IBM Brazil. She's Brazilian. But she also counsels the Brazilian government and civil society groups on migrating on IT matters. Third person I interviewed that was Beatriz Buzanich, and she has a background in communication sciences. And she's a free software activist, and she took part at the World Summit on the Information Society. Okay. So when we talk about this digital divide, that is not just one divide between on and offliners. In fact, it's more like a whole complex. So in this lecture, I talk about the global digital divide, and that signifies, the differences between countries that are online and countries that are offline. So, and since we have a great north-south divide in our world, so for the most part, citizens of the northern countries, richer countries, are online, while citizens from poor and developing countries are mostly offline. And part of this digital divide complex is as well the social divide, and this signifies differences between on and offliners within the same country. We have a gender divide, as more men than women surf the net. We have a divide, I never can pronounce this word, rural. It's R-U-R-I-L, or I might just say countryside. So because you have, of course, much better and more bandwidth in cities than you have on the countryside. Language barriers are an important part of this whole problem, since approximately 80% of the web content is written in English, but that is a language that is roughly understood by maybe 1 in 10 people worldwide. So this excludes then, of course, a lot of people. Then we have a democratic divide, and this signifies differences between people who do use digital resources to make their voices heard in political processes, and people who do not do this, who do not have the chance to do this. And on a more practical level, of course, you have lack of bandwidth, hardware, appropriate software, computer skills. And what's a very important issue as well is that in developing nations, in poor countries, you often have extremely high costs for an internet connection. Okay, so what has access to information and communication technologies to do with development? I said some words in the beginning about this issue. So since the mid-1990s, the internet became a mass medium. And shortly after, the digital divide appeared on the political agenda because people noticed a very sad continuation. And that was that, so while in the industrial age, although most of the material resources are located in the southern hemisphere, citizens of poor and developing nations have not benefited from the situation because for the most part, the exploitation of these material resources is and was located by the richer countries, respectively by their corporations. And in the so-called digital age, the situation simply continues because non-material goods, information and knowledge, and systems that take care of the distribution of non-material goods, they are again controlled by the richer countries. So while people from the north, from the richer countries do have access, people from the south are excluded. So much for the background of this whole policy issue. Okay, free software, open source software. One question, may I have a microphone in my hand? Is that possible? That would be great. Okay. Thank you. Okay, perfect. So otherwise I just verdrehen meinen Hals, so this is much more convenient now. All right, so free software, open source software is having, its very own economics, very own culture, very own values, and it's completely different to the world of proprietary software, which for the most part means Windows, of course. And you can trace this being so different from the free software is that you have like 4 characteristics so that make up for this being so different from free software, from open source. So, and the first characteristic is that the software can be run for any purpose. Second one is source code is freely accessible and it can be modified and maybe used for educational purposes. Third one is that the software can be distributed and copied without restrictions. And fourth one is that it can be distributed and copied in modified versions. And that's, of course, completely different if you compare that to proprietary software. And on this slide, I just put down the most basic differences you have between these 2 models of treating code, of software models. So while with free software, you do have access to source code, some words on source code. I believe that most people in this room do know about source code, but maybe there's someone who doesn't. So source code is like the DNA of software, and if you want to make modifications, you only can do it if you have access to source code. You do not have access to source code with proprietary software, and while with free software, the business model is based on providing service, since you give away the software, the product for free. Completely different case in proprietary software, so they generate their profit by selling licenses, but of course they charge for support. Okay, and the last one I talked about that, so free software licenses allow free distribution and modification of software, so the GPL is like the most prominent and brilliant license we have there. With proprietary software, so that's just not allowed. All right, so now I'm going to switch on intellectual property rights and software, which means patents and copyrights, because that is very closely linked. I want to say something about Brazil, because Brazil is the country that has explicitly promoted free software, open source in recent years. So they're integrated into programs aiming at bridging the digital divide, and they're in a process of migrating their own public IT infrastructure. They do all kinds of things. And this pro-Linux policy is closely linked with arguments concerning intellectual property rights. So because developing and poor nations, they have been complaining for years that the existing IPR systems do not work for their benefit, but rather reflect the interests of the richer world, of the developed countries. So poor countries say that, strong IP, intellectual property rights, or maybe we should say like classic intellectual property rights systems, they say that this actually hinders them in their development. To make this point more clear, I'm going to say some words behind the idea of intellectual property, but not a lot, because after this lecture, Carsten will do a lecture about this, and so he will go into this in much more detail. So the original idea behind intellectual property is, there's nothing wrong with that, it's pretty understandable. So innovators and creative people, they create something, they make something new, and then they are rewarded with a temporary, the R noise again, with a timely limited monopoly, and this allows them to charge far higher prices than they could if there was competition. So bad thing is then that follow-up innovations decelerate, they are much slower. But the idea is that, society as a whole